Without further ado, I do want to welcome, to get us started, Roxanna Velasquez, the museum's executive director.
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you all for being here. Welcome to another wonderful symposium. I was just telling one of the board members here that this is exactly what we love. You know, this is going to be a feast. This is going to be really, well, I won't create more expectations, but we have started planning this more than 2 years ago, and it takes a lot. So those of you that have not seen the show, I cannot help myself but share with you how great this exhibition is. It has toured already 2 other sites, Princeton and Blanton Museum in Austin, Texas. Thank you, Marika, for curating this show. And as many of you, yes, applauses to the curator. It is really great and a privilege to have you back here in San Diego. And I would just like to briefly, again, excite you for this collection, one of the biggest treasures of the San Diego Museum of Art, the Binney collection. And I always pay homage to Edwin Binney, right, the greatest individual donor who was even a docent and shared his collection, his treasures, for the enjoyment of the world. Thank you, Edwin Binney, wherever you are. So I would like to welcome the scholars here. All of you, thank you so much. And just introduce Sabiha al-Khemir, Dr. Sabiha al-Khemir. It's a pleasure to have you here. And thank you for accepting to moderate today this lecture and to give the tours. So let me share with you why we are so honored and privileged of having you among the rest of the wonderful scholars. Sabiha al-Khemir is a Tunisian writer, illustrator, and expert in Islamic art. She was the founding director of the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, Qatar, that beautiful building done by IMP and opened to the public in 2008. Raised in Corba, Tunisia, Dr. al-Khemir attended a Quranic school as a child. She's fluent in and lectures internationally in English, Arabic, French, in addition to speaking Italian and Spanish. Dr. al-Khemir graduated from the University of Tunis, École Normale Supérieure, with a degree in English literature, then proceeded to her MA in Islamic art and archaeology and a Ph.D. from the London University School of Oriental and African Studies. In 1990, she was postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, and some of her first scholarly activities were evident in her Ph.D. dissertation, The Palace of Sid at Mulk and Fatimi Matri. Publications from Sabiha span from scholarly books such as Beauty and Believe and Noor, The Art and Science. That's a wonderful catalog that accompany a beautiful exhibition that I had the privilege of seeing in the Dallas Museum of Art. And recently she was the consultant for the Dallas Museum of Art, where she secured a magnificent collection of Islamic art. So thank you for all what you do. Thank you for joining us here in San Diego. And thank you, all of you, for supporting our better understanding of the world and enjoying the soul of the Indian paintings. Welcome again to your museum, the San Diego Museum of Art.
Thank you, Madam Director, for that generous introduction. Welcome to your museum and welcome to this symposium. This is my first time in San Diego, not in California, but my first time in San Diego, and the first impression as I landed, wow, this is such a relaxed place. Positive energy, wonderful, beautiful. So to see you turn up on Saturday morning so early for a symposium that is specialized, academic, I am impressed and I am warmed by your presence. So thank you for coming. Could you please applaud the audience? specialized investigation stays in a very small, closed circle unless it is shared with the public. Today, we have 4 distinguished scholars. Each one of them will speak about one epic of South Asia. And together, they are going to give you an idea, more than an idea. They are going to stimulate, inspire the intellect and the heart. So be prepared for, as Madam Director said, a feast. Structure-wise, please have your questions. We will have the questions at the end of the session. There are 4 speakers. We will have 2 speakers, then a coffee break, then 2 speakers, and then we will have a panel discussion. So do have your questions. We really want them. Hold on to them and come up with them at the end of the lectures. My first speaker, I would like to introduce Professor Daniel Ehnbom. You have the biographies, so I'm not going to read every word that you have there, but I just would like to share with you that Professor Inborn, who is a lecturer, he's teaching at the University of Virginia for many years, since 1992. He is steeped in the studies of India for several reasons. One of them, that what is interesting, is it started a long time ago with his family, where he tells me his grandfather's uncle was a sea captain in the Swedish East India Company. And so the family traveled a lot in India, and so we are here presenting not only a scholar who is, really specialized in his field, but someone who is steeped in the culture, who has traveled a lot and has done field work in both India and Pakistan, etc. And his interest in general is focused on mainly 15th, 16th century miniatures, Indian miniatures, but he has great interest in early sculptures and so on, which is what you carrying your research on at the moment. And one of his books, he has many publications, but I highlight Indian miniatures, which I remember the library journal said it was a reference book, which I happen to have in my library. So today, he's going to speak to us about the development and spread of illustration of the Bhagavata Purana in North India. When I asked him why has he worked on the Bhagavata, he said, well, it started all with the intellectual. I love the illustrations. I am fascinated by the intellectual problem. And then the deeper I went, the bigger it became, and more questions arose. So he is going to be leading us through this interesting field of the Bhagavata. Please join me in a warm welcome to our distinguished speaker.
Thank you for that generous introduction. And I'm very grateful to be here again at the San Diego Museum of Art for the Epic Tales exhibition. And I'd especially like to thank all of you, from the director to the curators to the staff, for all your help and hard work in making this happen. And I'd especially like to join your director in thanking the curator, Marika Sardar, who created the exhibition that is the occasion for all of us coming here and being together today. So thank you very much for having me and having us all here. I'm here to talk about the Bhagavata Purana, which is a text that is the scriptural, Sanskrit scriptural statement on the life of Vishnu. We don't know exactly when it was composed, nor do we know exactly where it was composed, but it reached its present form sometime around the 9th, 10th century or so, and has been a pretty standard a text on Vishnu since then. The Binney collection at the San Diego Museum has great examples of illustrations of the Bhagavata Purana, some of which you'll see in the exhibition, some of which I'll show you today that you perhaps have seen already or will see another time. Ed Binney was a friend of mine, and he's been gone now for so long it doesn't seem possible to me. But he was a brilliant and visionary collector. His office was right over there. And he'd be delighted that all of you came today to learn about things he collected so avidly and loved so deeply. The Binney collection in the San Diego Museum of Art is one of the most important collections of Indian painting in the world, not just in California or in the United States or in the West, but one of the most important collections in the world. So this talk is for you, Ed. When one thinks of illustrations of Indian texts, one of the texts that comes immediately to mind is, of course, the Bhagavata Purana. Now, I start every lecture, my students know this, I start every lecture with a map, and I always say, we're going to look at things today, and just to give you a little sense of orientation, we'll look at material from the Delhi-Agra region. I'm going to show you a relief from a temple from down here in Devgarh. It's surrounded by the state of Madhya Pradesh, but it's in a little bit of the state of UP that comes down into Madhya Pradesh. And we're going to look at a temple in Rajasthan in the former state of Mewar. So, and then we'll look briefly at a picture from up here. So we'll be sort of ranging around a bit of North India. The Bhagavata Purana is considered by many worshippers of Krishna to be a kind of fifth Veda. The four Vedas, of course, are the foundational texts of Hinduism, and the Bhagavad is considered to be a kind of fifth Veda by worshippers of Vishnu, specifically worshippers of Krishna. The text has 12 books, and the most frequently illustrated of these 12 books is the 10th book, and it is arguably the most frequently illustrated text in the narrative traditions of Indian painting. The only possible competitor is probably the Ramayana, about which the distinguished curator of the exhibition will speak. But it is certainly, this 10th book is so frequently illustrated that one really needs to know it to come to terms with Indian painting at all. It narrates the life of Krishna, who by most accounts is the 8th of the 10 incarnations of Vishnu. The earliest surviving version of the 10th book, the earliest surviving illustrated version of the 10th book of the Bhagavat, is a dispersed series of illustrations with full text that was originally designed to have some 360 illustrations. It is undated, and no place of production is given. Here you see an example of it from the Binney collection. And this is the slaying of this demon, a sort of Aghasura, a kind of a reptilian demon who swallows up cowherd boys and cows, and Krishna rescues them and kills the demon, one of his many demon-killing episodes. It can be dated on grounds of style to about 1520 to 1530, and it was probably produced in the Delhi-Agra region, possibly in the great city of Mathura. The entire Sanskrit text was illustrated, and it appears on the reverse of the leaves. You see it here, in a clear hand. And there are vernacular captions on many of the illustrations. Those are names that I just pointed to. The leaves are thoroughly scattered around the world. Indeed, since the fact of its thorough dispersal is so significant in its study, I call it the dispersed Bhagavata Purana. Not that it's the only one that's been dispersed, but that's a sort of essential point of its identity. Many are lost, unfortunately. Some were documented and have disappeared. Things still turn up. And the San Diego Museum of Art has 4, an unusually high number to be together in one place, actually, even though there were originally 360. And in the 1950s, the entire series could have been had. But at the princely price of 5 rupees a page, it was thought of as rather expensive in those days. The rupee, of course, was worth more in the 1950s than it is now. But still, let's just say they're worth more than a little more than 5 rupees a page today. One of the important things, these two, this one shows Krishna and his brother in the idyllic forests in the area around the Yamuna River, not too far from Mathura. And this shows Krishna and Balarama in the forest, protecting the cows. One of Krishna's epithets is Gopala, the protector of cows. Here he's protecting cows from this rather wonderful tiger. And I like the little bunny down here, too. And one of my all-time favorites, and I'm going to talk about this at some length, Krishna, this is also in the Bini collection, Krishna attacking Pragjyotishapura, the citadel of the demon Naraka, whom you see down here. And we'll come back to Krishna and Naraka in a little while. One of the important things that distinguishes these illustrations, as you might sense from looking at them, is their lively and inventive compositions. This is a particularly fine example with this kind of driving diagonal connecting Krishna with his intended victim, this sort of wonderful vitality of this fortress. But these illustrations, as I said, this is the earliest surviving illustrated example, and these illustrations seem to spring fully formed at the very beginning of the tradition. So where did these lively compositions come from? Well, to try to answer this question, it's useful to consider more broadly the question of the representation of Krishna in the 16th century and before. The vitality of a revival of the worship of Krishna starting in the 15th century and extending to the 17th century under the religious leader Vallabhacharya, who lived from 1479 to 1531, so he might have been alive when that group of pictures was made, and his followers and his contemporaries, underlies the production of illustrated series such as the dispersed Bhagavata Purana, as well as many other illustrated 16th century versions of the life of Krishna that followed, which are also represented in the Bini collection, which is a very comprehensive collection. As I noted, one of the notable features of these illustrations of the dispersed Bhagavata Purana is their vibrant and inventive compositions. Now, there's been a long tradition of the representation of the Krishna story in sculpture dating from before the composition of the Bhagavata Purana, dating at least from the Gupta period, which is the 4th to 6th century. And you see here the great Vishnu temple at Devgar in the district, in Lalitpur district in Uttar Pradesh, a district that kind of comes down like an appendix into Madhya Pradesh, but it's entirely surrounded by MP, but it's actually in UP. And this is a temple that is of the 5th century. Some people try to date it 6th century. They're entitled to be wrong. It's 5th century. And I could argue that out, but it would bore you. I subject my classes to it, but I won't subject you to it. And so this superb 5th century temple, which originally had subsidiary shrines at each corner, and I show you, it's been recently restored, and I find the restoration of the superstructure even more confusing than the damaged version, so I show you the damaged version, because at least I'm used to it. But around the plinth, there are reliefs that illustrate the life of Krishna. They also illustrate the Ramayana, but these are particular ones I'm showing. This comes from Krishna. It's an episode when Krishna was born. His uncle had been warned that he was going to kill him, so his uncle tries to have all the male children killed, but his father, in the meantime, has taken him away and gotten a replacement baby. So you see the sort of exchange of babies happening here. Here in the plinth area. But as you can see here, these compositions tend to be relatively simple. They're monoscenic. They're just summaries, unlike the action-filled, continuous narratives of the early Bhagavat. And as I keep saying, those paintings that we looked at come from the earliest surviving illustrated version of the Bhagavat. And as I've already asked, where does the inspiration for these lively illustrations come? Well, when we look at a sculpture, one of the places we can look at is a very interesting temple called the Kumbhashyama Temple in the fortress of Chittor in the former state of Mewar. And by the way, for those of you who know the story of the Hindi poetess and mystic Mirabai, this is not only one of the temples where she is said to have worshipped. By some accounts, it is the temple in which she was absorbed into an image of Krishna. She did not die. She was absorbed into an image, so intense was her devotion. And according to some accounts, it happened in this temple. Of course, there's more than one account, and there are other places that claim it's where it happened too, but this is one of them. It's a temple that was originally built in the 8th century, and it was restored in the 15th century. And this rather damaged panel that you see here comes from the 15th century restoration. It illustrates the story of Krishna, and it breaks these sort of simple compositional conventions that have been in place since Devgar in new ways. Here you see the whole panel. You can see it's a bit battered, but we go from the birth of Krishna down through a series of his killing of demons and things. He was an avid demon killer, even as an infant. And here you see the birth, the exchange of babes. You might even recognize that from basically the same composition we just saw at Devgar, but here incorporated into a much more elaborate composition. It's this upper register here. And here you can see a sequence of demon killings. Here he kills the demoness Putana. Here he kills, one of my favorite stories, a demon disguised as a cart, the killing of the cart demon. And here is the subjugation of a snake in the Yamuna River. He doesn't kill this king of the snakes. He makes an agreement with him, and he agrees to leave the river to stop poisoning the water. It's kind of a metaphor for doing something about the pollution of the Yamuna, which is actually a project in which I'm involved with as an art historian. They even found room for an art historian in an anti-pollution project. And you can see that that this river, in a way, kind of pulls together elements of this composition shown sequentially. Here he's killing a wind demon. I think we need a new, we might need a new battery for this for the next speaker. But this is just a tiny bit of evidence for this significant compositional transformation that we see happening in the 16th century. To understand this situation further, we can turn to what might be thought of as an unlikely place, Mughal painting in the reign of Akbar. Akbar ruled, he was the third of the Mughal emperors. He ruled from 1556 until his death in 1605. And these are both in the Bini collection. We just looked at this wonderful circa 1520 to 1530. This picture, which is on, not in the exhibition, but you can go and see it in the in that open vault display area. It's in one of the drawers. And I'll tell you a little bit about it now, and why we're looking at it. The great Persian Razmnama is a translation of the Indian Sanskrit epic, the Mahabharata, the account of a great dynastic war that the historical kernel of the Mahabharata apparently took place around 1000 BC, and the Mahabharata as it exists today, again, the dating is very complex, and there's a lot of controversy about the dating, but most scholars think it was composed over a long period of time, between about the 4th century BC to the 4th century AD or so. But the Persian translation was prepared for Akbar between 1582 and 1584. His son said he was tired of the Persian classics. He wanted true stories. So Akbar had the Indian epics translated. And amusingly enough, in charge of the translation of the Mahabharata was one of the most bigoted courtiers who was made to work on translating from Sanskrit into Persian. About that time, the Imperial Mughal Workshop began a splendidly illustrated version of the text, a project that was completed about 1586. The manuscript is now in the Jaipur City Palace Museum, and nobody's seen it since the 19th century. Hardly anybody's seen it. I've tried. I've been to Jaipur 3 times to see it. Guess what? I haven't seen it. The last time I stood in front of the Maharaja's car and asked him if I could see it. And I couldn't. Even though I had his signed permission in my hand. I have to go to Delhi. That's why I'm standing in front of your car. But anyway, I didn't see it. And now he's gone to wherever Maharajas go when. So I don't bear a grudge. I try to think good thoughts, only good thoughts. But this manuscript contains as an appendix a version of the Harivansh, which is an account of the life of Vishnu that was probably composed around the 4th century or so. Another manuscript, apparently of the Harivansh alone, was completed about 1590. The text portion of this, along with 6 of the original illustrations, is preserved in the State Museum of Lucknow. A number of the illustrations have been removed, including this one that's in the Bini collection, probably as early as the 18th century, judging from their borders. And several of the pages are lost, but the rest are dispersed among public and private collections, including this one. And this page, I think, is one of the real splendors of the Bini collection. Both the Razmnama and the Harivansha include numerous illustrations of episodes from Krishna's life. And you see a comparison. This is the same episode. This is a picture, by the way, I know from experience, very popular with 5th grade boys. Robert Skelton, who was the former keeper of the Indian section of the Victoria and Albert Museum, and whose birthday is Monday, I think he's turning 90 on Monday, wrote a highly informative article about 6 leaves of this manuscript that are in the Victoria and Albert, that one of the main points of interest of the Harivansh manuscript illustrations is their vivid compositions. So when I read that a long time ago, I thought, yeah, vivid compositions, there may be a connection here. He suggests that the artists, and I quote Robert, were perhaps recreating the visions which had filled their minds in childhood during the spoken and acted reiteration of the stories. The visions that Skelton so vividly evokes are continuations and elaborations of the visual vocabulary of the illustration of the Krishna story common for centuries to the peoples of India. an examination of Rasamnama and Harivansha illustrations in relation to those of the same incidents from the dispersed Bhagavat reveals their common heritage and serves to illuminate further our understanding of the complex relationship between pre-Akbar and Akbar period compositions, a question actually that many illustrations in the Bini collection raise. And here you see what stylistically, although they're both from approximately the same region, they're both from the 16th century, but stylistically they are very different. Now, we know that this style was an important feeder style to Mughal painting, but you might be forgiven for not being immediately aware of that when you look at this picture from about 1590, this beautiful Mughal illustration. But they are the same story. And when you look at them for a moment, you start to see compositional parallels between the two of them. Notice, for example, a big one is the diagonal relationship between Krishna and his victim. Here, we've conflated the arrival with Krishna sending his discus, a kind of frisbee with a blade, that's cutting Naraka right in half. I think this is what appeals to the 5th grade boys. It's the splitting of the demon. So first of all, you have that. You have these sort of rather, particularly in the female form here, this is Krishna's wife Satyabhama, one of his wives, rather square-headed figure type. Krishna himself, rather square-headed. Most of the figures shown in profile, which is the preferred Indian manner, with the face, the head in profile, the preferred Indian manner, showing the human form. And even down to, notice the circular representation of the citadel, which is echoed in the more or less circular representation of the palace in which Naraka is being killed. So it's as though this is a kind of schematic representation of a composition, which is then fleshed out and turned into a more fully three-dimensional composition in the Mughal period. Of course, the format has changed, which is, I have a whole lecture on format, believe it or not, which I was giving at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and the curator was terrified I was going to be talking about format. He thought it sounded so boring. But the audience seemed to like it. I showed pretty pictures. That's what I always try to do. Now, this is another one. This is the slaying of another bad king named Jarasandha. And Krishna's brother is fighting him, and he can't actually kill him. He can't figure out how to kill him. And Krishna tells him how to kill him by taking a straw and splitting it in half. And what as his brother's fighting Jarasandha, and his brother realizes, oh, the way to kill him is to grab him and split him in half, which is what you see happening here. Here's Krishna splitting the straw, and here's his brother picking up on, oh, okay, that's how to kill him. And then down here, good work. This page is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and this is from the Jaipur Manuscript, a photograph, a black and white photograph, since, as mentioned above, I have not actually seen the manuscript in spite of 3 attempts. Now, when you look at this, again, you see, oh, stylistically very, very different. But, again, when you begin to think in terms of what are the underlying compositional devices, you have Krishna in a relationship to the main scene. This, of course, more thoroughly three-dimensionalized, more naturalistic in the Mughal manner, what Pramod Chandra called the emerging Mughal vision of naturalism. But look at a very interesting thing here. This is a very typical kind of Indian composition. And by the way, here's one of those vernacular captions that tells you what's happening. Very typical sort of Indian composition with 2 registers and a continuous narration. Here's the actual killing. Here's the aftermath. And when you look at the Mughal picture, although it is, again, a different format, and although it's a very different kind of picture, look at how it is basically divided into 2 registers. But the way it's done is there's a color shift right here. So you have this register that has the main scene, as you have here, and then you have the aftermath, the sort of people down here in a second register. So that double register is echoed in the Mughal composition, even though the composition is so different. So Skelton's suggestion of the spoken and acted reiteration of the stories in relation to the Mughal compositions can thus be equally applied to the earlier Bhagavata Purana illustrations. Though performance is by nature evanescent, and until modern recording techniques, there was no way to preserve even a shadow of any performance. We know from a literary record that there were performances of episodes of the life of the Krishna story dating back at least to the early 16th century, and a Dutch Sanskritist friend of mine tells me they go even earlier, and they survived into modern times. Jack Stratton Holley at Columbia wrote an essay called Did Surdas Perform the Bhagavata Purana? And he refers to performances whose existence is preserved in literary texts. Though really he's talking about recitation of the text, there's also a reference to actual performances. And there were 16th century figures who both approved of them, the author Malik Muhammad Jayasi, and disapproved of them, Guru Nanak, the founder of Sikhism, who thought they were vulgar and should be suppressed. Malik Muhammad Jayasi thought they were okay. He thought they could be improved a little, but they were okay. So to recapitulate, at a time of a great revival of the worship of Krishna, centered in the Mathura area, but felt widely throughout India, we know that there were performances of the life of Krishna. At the same time, there emerges an illustrated version of the life of Krishna, and as I have said repeatedly, the first surviving illustrated one, possibly painted right there in the Mathura region, that has within it frequent references to a kind of performative tradition of the stories. Might we then speculate that the suddenly vivid and unusually lively illustrations of the dispersed Bhagavata Purana reflect, even imperfectly, a popular tradition of performance of the Krishna story, Skelton's acted reiteration of the beloved tales of the cowherd god? Well, we can never know. And what of these inventive compositions? Once developed, they survive in surprisingly consistent and sometimes altered forms in countless examples spread throughout North India. And I'm beginning to think also, having looked at some Bhagavats, including material in this collection, South Indian painting styles as well. Here you have an example of a manuscript from 1688, shows the same subject, and one thing that's interesting, they both show guns, which naturally aren't in the early Sanskrit text, and they preserve that strong diagonal and so on, so you can see that, again, this is a kind of prototype of an illustration like that. And here you see Krishna and his brother sporting in the forest. This is an 18th century version of the same story. This isn't in the Binney collection, but there is a page of this in the collection that bears the date of 1769. And you can see, again, that we have surprising similarities, anchoring by the trees, Krishna in the same location, massaging his brother's legs and feet, the cowherds playing, the cows to the right grazing. We don't know specifically the exact mechanisms by which these transmissions of compositional devices occurred, but we can see that they occurred. As my colleague David Summers, very distinguished art historian who's recently retired, says, something happened, and we can figure some of it out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Professor Inborn, for this very interesting and enjoyable, we all agree, enjoyable presentation. I'm sure Robert Skelton would have enjoyed this tremendously, I can assure you. So thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Marika Sardar. Now, this is the raison d'etre we're here, almost, because it's Marika who has curated the exhibition Epic Tales, which is open, and you all will see it. It is absolutely magnificent. It's beautifully laid out. It offers a real enjoyable journey. So Marika curated the exhibition, and she was also the main author of the catalog, which is a beautiful catalog. I hope you all get it. It's really worth having, worth reading, and it's beautiful. So it's erudite and beautiful. She is now the curator of Asian art, South Asian art, in the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha. As you heard from Madam Director, she mentioned the museum, which is a magnificent building by IMP in Qatar, in Doha, where Marika now works. She has worked there since 2016. And in a way, it's where I was as founding director. So that's my previous life, and I feel it is now in good hands, in Dr. Sardar's hands, and they are planning a new installation for the museum, to mark the 10th anniversary, which is really practically this year, but the installation will open next year. Prior to this, she has worked extensively with the installation of the Metropolitan Museum. The galleries reopened in 2011, and her work spanned various areas from Nishapur pottery of 10th century Persia to Safavid Iran to South Asia, of course, which is her field and her specialty. And today she's going to speak to us about the Ramayana, and that is going to be a fascinating journey, I'm sure. So her lecture exactly is illustrating the Ramayana from sculpture to painting. Welcome, please, with me, Dr. Sardar.
Hi, good morning. It's so wonderful to be back here in San Diego and to be among old colleagues and good friends again, and to see, of course, the wonderful Bini paintings on view in this really great installation. Having seen the show now in 3 different venues, I think it's really looking fantastic here at home in San Diego. And this morning, I am excited to speak to you about the Ramayana. You'll see a lot of connections to the presentation we've just heard. There'll be a stop in Devgar with upper period paintings, and there is also another manuscript locked up in the Jaipur collections that relates to the history of this text as well. There's surely much to be said about illustrations to the great Hindu epic of the Ramayana, but what I'll focus on today is this topic in relation to the concept for the exhibition, Epic Tales. And the idea behind the show was to help museum visitors, to help you understand the original motivation and context for the outstanding paintings in the SDMA collection. I wanted to explain the story behind the paintings you're looking at, and to help you understand that the painting's primary purpose was in storytelling, and that they weren't standalone images meant to showcase the art achievements of an individual artist, the way we think of the Soroya or the Bouguereau here in our own collection at San Diego. But this is an impression that's quite hard to get away from. When we show the paintings framed and hung on the walls, a museum solution that's practical and very difficult to get away from. There are reasons for this, but it does inadvertently cause confusion about the nature of these paintings. I wanted to remind viewers that they were created as part of a larger series of images on the pages of books, and that those books could take many forms in India, as the examples shown here demonstrate. I also wanted to give you some tools to reflect on what you're seeing, to urge you to start thinking about the images you're looking at in relation to the texts that they illustrated, to consider the moment in the story the artist has chosen to illustrate and how this affects the impact of the story, and to notice how different artists have chosen to convey the element of time in what are static images. And I hope that these thoughts and questions will send you back to the exhibition with a new way of looking at the paintings. So first, a brief resume on the Ramayana, which tells the story of Prince Rama of Ayodhya. And it's a story that's known in many forms, but the most widespread version is a Sanskrit language composition of 24,000 couplets arranged into 7 books, which relates the major points of Rama's life and presents him as an exemplary ruler. In the barest of outlines, it runs as follows. In the first book, the gods entreat Vishnu, the blue-skinned deity seen at the center of this painting here, to take human form in order to defeat the demon Ravana. At the same time, a king named Dasrath invites a sage, shown here as a white-bearded man in an animal skin, to perform a set of rituals in order to help his wives produce male heirs to his throne. These rituals conjure a divine being who offers a consecrated dish of a rice and milk mixture that Dasrath's wives ingest, thereby becoming pregnant. And you can see the wives here being given this food. And through this process, Vishnu descends to earth in the form of the 4 sons of King Dasrath, Rama and his brothers Lakshmana, Bharata, and Shatrughna. The second book tells of Rama's youth and marriage to the princess Sita. He's intended to succeed his father as king, but through the machinations of one of his father's other wives, Rama is forced to give up his position and move into exile in the forest, which is what we see here, Rama, Sita, and his brother Lakshmana in their simple clothing made of leaves and bark, living in the forest. So they live in peace in the forest until Sita is abducted by Ravana, the aforementioned demon wreaking havoc among the gods. The following 2 books relate the desperate search for Sita, who's imprisoned at Ravana's palace on the island of Lanka, culminating in the Book of War, in which Ravana is finally defeated and Sita is rescued. Rama, Sita, and Lakshmana then return to Ayodhya, where Rama takes the throne. In the final book, Sita is repudiated by Rama, who has succumbed to doubts that she has remained faithful while in Ravana's possession. Sita is sent away and gives birth to and raises Rama's twin sons at the hermitage of Valmiki, the sage from whom the boys learn the story of Ram. The boys then travel to Ram's court, where they perform the epic for their father, unaware of their relationship to him. Ram and Sita then reunite, but Sita is tested again before returning to the earth from which she was born, and Rama ascends to the heavens. While full of examples of love, bravery, and battle, the Ramayana's main message is to underscore the god Vishnu's role in maintaining justice in the universe, and to convey the qualities of a good king and a dutiful wife. The story was enormously compelling and was known across the subcontinent in a number of versions told in nearly all of its regional languages, in addition to the Valmiki version in formal Sanskrit. Among the most influential of these other versions is Tulsidasa's in Hindi, but others in Telugu, Oriya, and so on are very well known, including the version included on this manuscript in the exhibition, which, as we learned while researching, is in Dingal, a literary language of Rajasthan. These tellings started to emerge from about the 11th century onwards. As for other epics in India, the earliest evidence for pictorial depictions of the Rama story come in the form of sculpture, examples of which long predate the kind of paintings encountered in this exhibition. Sculptures depicting episodes from the epic's greater tradition were made as early as the 2nd century BC. From that time on, sculptures representing the story of Ram, or in this case his father, Dasrath, can be found throughout India, and on buildings with a variety of confessions, on Buddhist stupas, as this example shows, or Hindu temples dedicated to Vishnu, Shiva, or the goddess. In its earliest phases, this sculptural tradition conveys the Rama story in rather terse fashion, with just a few relief panels to represent the entire arc of Ram and Sita's adventures. So we're visiting the Devgar temple again, and I hope the date that I have included on my slide here is acceptable to Dan. So there were once a total of 9 panels adorning the temple's plinth, depicting elements of Ram's early life, his exile with Sita and Lakshmana, and Sita's rescue. And those panels have since been removed to the National Museum. However, in the following centuries, in concert with the rise of the many vernacular versions of the story discussed above, and the implied renewed interest in Rama and his epic, the story began to be told in greater detail through temple sculpture. In central India, at the Papanatha Temple of Patadakal, for instance, there are over 40 narrative panels running from west to east, decorating the temple's 2 early 8th century mandaps with images from the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. In a later stage of temple architecture, the story of Rama came to even greater prominence. The Ramachandra Temple, known today as the Hazara Rama or 1,000 Ramas, is, for instance, dedicated to Ram himself. The temple was built in the early 15th century at Vijayanagar, a site in the Karnataka state, long identified as Kishkinda, the realm of the monkey king Sugriva. Inside the temple, Vishnu and several figures from the Ramayana are depicted, and it is presumed that icons of Rama, Lakshmana, and Sita were once enshrined in the sanctuary. The inner face of the temple's compound wall features panels depicting episodes from the Ramayana, organized in 5 registers, to be read from left to right and from top to bottom. A square hall added to the temple in the 16th century is also covered with Ramayana stories, with 108 panels arranged in 3 registers that were read in a clockwise fashion. They start with a depiction of Valmiki relating his story to a king, and conclude with Rama's coronation at Ayodhya, with an emphasis on the books of Rama's youth and exile, the search for Sita, and Hanuman's time in Lanka. The story is completed on another small shrine within the compound dedicated to Sita that is illustrated with scenes from the last book of the epic, possibly using a local Telugu version of the story. On the screen now are 2 of these relief panels, one from the beginning of the story, detailing the miraculous nature of Rama's conception, and one of the events from his time in the forest killing demons and preparing for his eventual combat with Ravana, in which he frees a woman turned into a rock after being unfaithful to her husband. This last phase of temple architecture dates to about the same time as the rise of painted versions of the story, found initially within manuscripts dedicated to other texts. The earliest known paintings of this subject are, for instance, embedded in manuscripts of the Balagopala Stuti, in which the story of Rama is related to the child Krishna. In one such example from Western India, dated to the late 15th century, and not in the exhibition, but from the Bini collection, several scenes from the Book of Exile unfold across the page's 2 registers. The events in this image commence when Ravana's ally Maricha appears before Rama and Sita in the form of the golden deer, as seen on the top. So we see Ram and Sita in the forest playing a game, Parcheesi here, and then the deer appears, and Sita asks Rama to go chase the deer for her, and we see him hunting the deer here. Then Ravana appears as a holy man begging Sita for food. Down here. Ravana then grabs Sita and sets off for his island home of Lanka. Jatayu, the Vulture King, this bird here, tries to save Sita but is felled by Ravana. In the last scene of the page, skipping much intervening action, Hanuman, the monkey god, is shown having found Sita imprisoned in Lanka. He He presents Rama's ring to her so that she knows help is on the way. And that takes place down here. Likely, successive paintings would have filled in the story's conclusion, as surviving paintings from other Bhagavata Stuti manuscripts do. This simplified and highly efficient manner of conveying the narrative has much in common with the sculptural depictions of the Ramayana that both predate this manuscript and continue to be made at roughly the same time. The images are arranged in registers, with little of the background or the setting of the characters being conveyed, and the figures' broad gestures and actions conveying the basic plot points. No emotional shading, usually provided by the expressions on the figures' faces or implied by the actions of the subsidiary characters, is given in this context. Manuscripts with paintings illustrating a written text of the Ramayana itself, the type of work presented in this exhibition, finally appear in the late 16th century when the Mughal Emperor Akbar ordered that a Persian translation of the story be made, so this should sound familiar, and at the same time had his book workshop create a deluxe manuscript with 176 paintings to accompany this translation. And so this is the manuscript that is now in, again, the Jaipur Royal Collection and is generally inaccessible, but some color images are circulating of it. Others in his courtly circle also commissioned copies of the Ramayana, and as a group, these manuscripts thoroughly changed approaches to presenting the story in visual form by extending, deepening, and surrounding the plot with much narrative texture. In these paintings, so different in nature from the earliest Rama illustrations, the characters of this ancient text are plunged into a world of Mughal architecture and dress, with figures arranged on several planes and placed in a variety of outdoor and indoor settings. A reading of depth and distance becomes integral to an understanding of the action. This is quite unlike the early sculptures and early paintings of the Rama story, in which all of the figures are arrayed along the same ground line, and where architecture and landscape serve to separate scenes rather than ensconce the figures. Thus, although a tradition of visually rendering many of the episodes from the text, as well as conventions for depicting certain characters and for depicting certain events already existed by the time Akbar's artists took up their brushes, there seems to be little relation between their work and the Bhagavata Stuti images or the many temple reliefs that preceded them. And I'll just point out now that having left this wonderful collection in my new museum, we are very lucky to have this manuscript here, nearly the entire thing intact. It was a copy of the Ramayana in Persian translation made for Akbar's mother, Hamida Banu Begum, and so we're planning a book and an exhibition if I can tempt you all to come out to Doha sometime next fall. However, once this trend for illustrating the Ramayana in lavish fashion was established, there's much evidence that the illustrative style developed in sculpture was eventually picked up in the 17th and 18th century paintings made at the Rajput and Pahari courts of northern India. In the paintings produced in those regions, landscapes and architectural settings are employed more evocatively, but the action would still cohere if the figures were extracted from that background. The painting on the screen now, for instance, comes from a 7-volume set produced for Rana Jagat Singh of Mewar, completed between 1649 and 1653. It originally had over 400 illustrations. This one shows the moment when Ram learns from his father that his brother Bharata will be installed as heir. We see that moment on the left in the palace, while on the right, Ram takes leave from his mother before heading into the forest. In this painting, we have the impression of events from the story being represented as individual panels arranged across the page, much like the sculptural panels on the exterior of the temple. But in addition to thinking about the development of illustrations of this epic and why it moved in and out of popularity for royal patronage at different moments in time, another way to approach these paintings is in terms of their visual properties. One thing to consider is if and how the images worked together with a text, and what is quite interesting to note, and that again came about through our preparation for this exhibition, is that it's quite rare to find the entire text of the Ramayana actually accompanying the paintings in a manuscript, and you see it excerpted and used in many different ways. So the rare examples that do include the full text would include the Persian examples, the earliest of which, as we said, date to Akbar's reign, or the Sanskrit manuscript made for Jagat Singh. In these manuscripts, there are hundreds of pages with just text, no images on them at all, between the paintings, and the act of reading about the action closely informs the viewer's perception of the paintings when they appear at intervals throughout the text. In the example on the left, the text is even interwoven into the image. So here you're reading in Persian from right to left, so you're reading along, and then there are two additional lines of the text located within the painting, and then you turn the page and continue reading. However, there are also many, many examples of manuscripts with only excerpts of the text, in which the images take on a more equal role in the storytelling process, or require the help of a storyteller to narrate additional details while an audience looks at the paintings. Such an example would be this page in the exhibition, in which the text, which you see on the right, is actually on the back of the painting. And it's a combination of excerpts from Valmiki and a brief summary written in the local language that relate directly to the image and summarize or skip over the intervening elements. So this slide, as I said, shows you the front and back of one of the pages here in the exhibition, and here are other folios with their reverses from this particular manuscript, and it shows the varying amounts of text accompanying each page. Another related from the example from the exhibition is this painting, which on the reverse has one chapter from Valmiki's Ramayana that directly relating to the painting, followed by a commentary on it from another text. Even this approach, though it involves quite a bit of text, does separate the act of reading and viewing, and makes for a different kind of interaction between them, and between the reader and these different sources of information, than in the kind of manuscript in which text and image are integrated. And to quickly note, this is a story we've seen in a couple different versions at this point, in which Rama frees Ahalya from the rock. So we see her first drawn in pencil. You'll have to see it, I think, in person, in the rock. Then she is freed here, thanking Ram, and then going to her husband and apologizing. Finally, there are many examples of paintings in the exhibition that have no text at all. On the front or reverse, there might at most be a short title telling you which of the Ramayana books to which the painting belongs, and a number indicating the place of the painting within the sequence of illustrations to that book, but nothing else. So here are two more paintings from the exhibition with pictures of the reverse of each that show exactly this state of affairs. In these kinds of series, there are typically hundreds of paintings which end up telling the story in the absence of words, as opposed to manuscripts with extensive texts which tend to have fewer pictures. In this case, the viewers focus fully on the image and any kind of visual clues for following the story. While we might imagine viewers of these kinds of paintings could have been listening to a recitation of the text, visually they were not distracted by words or writing. And I think keeping in mind these differences among the various manuscript types deepens an appreciation of how the paintings functioned in their original context. It's also important to consider how the artist has chosen to represent a story which unfolds over the course of time and which involves a sequence of events. One choice would be to include several moments from the same story, all integrated into the same scene with one unified setting in which certain figures are repeated. So this painting, for instance, which we started, might at first appear to be a series of simultaneous views into a palace building. But with a little understanding of the context, however, we soon realize that each room or courtyard represents a subsequent event, starting from the left as Brahma seeks assistance from Shiva, then Vishnu, before finally one of the queens is impregnated with the consecrated food that will allow her to give birth to Rama. So that unfolds from left to right across the painting. Another option would be to select a single moment to stand in for the longer narrative, as in this case, in which we see the divine apparition emerging from the flames of the sacrifice to present Dasharatha with the offering that will impregnate his wives. This is the same part of the story as in the previous painting, but that does not bring the event into the same context of the events of the larger universe of the gods and their machinations, but focusing rather on the visually striking appearance of the figure in the flames and the anticipations of the king's wives shown on the right. While these different choices could simply be interpreted as artistic license, they do have an effect on how the viewer perceives the story. If, for example, a certain vignette is drawn out over the course of several images, it could tell us that the story is particularly significant within the contents of the text. It could heighten our sense of anticipation. But if many moments are presented in one scene, it could have the effect of downplaying the importance of the story, or perhaps matching the level of activity in a particularly exhilarating moment by packing all of the action into one dynamic image. Finally, we can consider what a study of the Ramayana paintings brings to our understanding of this story and its cultural impact, which typically comes from a study of the different written texts. While analyses of the many written versions of the story focus on the transformation of Rama into a divinity or other esoteric aspects of the text, the paintings remind us of the story's other appealing aspects. In fact, the greatest number of paintings in Ramayana series are usually dedicated to Rama and Sita's life in the forest or the battle against Ravana. War, suspense, love, and the idealization of life outside the urban structure are thus revealed to many audiences to be the story's most compelling features.
Thank you, Dr. Sardar, for that very erudite lecture through the enchanting world of the Ramayana. The good news is we are exactly on time, and that means we are not stealing your moment for coffee and a break. Please enjoy the hospitality of this wonderful museum, and we will come back together at 11 o'clock to continue our journey with the intellect and the heart. Thank you. Okay. My dear refreshed audience, so we're back to listen to the next two scholars. My next speaker is Dr. Qamar Adamjee. Qamar. I love saying that word, Qamar. She said, please give me a very brief introduction, so I'm not going to do that. You see, the word Qamar is an Arabic word, which means the moon. And when you read even the Q, usually people hear Qamar, while it is Qamar. It's coming from me, Qamar. For me, like my name is not Sabiha, it's Sabiha. Ha. So these sounds are very symbolic of the invisible in the diversity. what we cannot see because it's not part of our sounds, part of our culture. So for me, symbolically, when I say Qamar, you know, it's really showing that diversity. So Dr. Adamjee is the Malavali Family Foundation Associate Curator of Art of Indian of the Subcontinent at the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. She has worked on various topics, actually. That's one of her, I think, characteristics, striking characteristics, because her work spans different areas and somehow goes between East and West, and you know, being originally from Pakistan, even the position is fascinating to look at things from either the sort of Islamic or Hindu, and I see that in your work. I have seen actually more than one exhibition curated by you, Pearls on a String, Artists, Poets, and Patrons at the Great Islamic Court, which was at the Vulture Museum, and also the Splendors of India's at the Royal Courts in the V&A. So today, she's speaking to us about the Shandayan, an old story recast for new audiences. In fact, the subject matter of this lecture is also the subject matter of her PhD. So you are about to listen to an authority on the subject of this epic. Welcome, Dr. Qamar, please.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Sabiha, for that kind introduction, and for Marika for bringing us all together, and the colleagues at San Diego Museum for organizing this. So my topic today is the story of the Chandayan romance, the story of Chanda, the princess who is also named after the moon. And what I find very fascinating about this set of manuscripts in the story is the kind of hybridity and cross-cultural engagement that is manifest in these, not only in the story, but in the illustrated versions of it. And just a pretty picture to get us started. The Chandayan romance, which was composed by one Maulana Dawood of Dalmau in North India in Uttar Pradesh in 1379, was written as a Muslim Sufi mystical narrative, but it was based on a story in the folk repertoire that even today exists in many parts of North India in various local languages, especially in Eastern India. So in the Bihar Bengal region, we find it in the Western India region as well, and everywhere in between, where even today it is performed and orally narrated. About nearly 400 verses of the 14th century version, the written version, are known through two partially incomplete and unillustrated manuscripts, and 5 illustrated manuscripts, all of which are also incomplete. Some are dispersed, such as there are 2 pages in the San Diego collection which are in the exhibition, and you'll be seeing here as well. They have been attributed to dates from the very late 15th century and mostly into the 16th century from different parts of North India, and the subject has been of a great deal of study, including by Dan here many years ago, whose work was influential to me. Each copy has a 6-line verse in couplets, and about 400 of these survive today. On the back, so what you're seeing on the left is the back. One side has a text page, one side has a painting. And the story is written in an Indian vernacular language, Hindavi, but transcribed in the Persian script. And each set of verses has a caption on top which is in Persian. So it's a really mixed bag of things which speak to the very interesting and intercultural set of exchanges in North India, especially during the 14th to 16th century, but continue later. Originally, they were in the form of a bound book, and 2 of the copies today survive as bound books. As you can see, they're very different, but on every page opening, where you read from right to left, a reader encounters the words of the poet first, and then looks at the painting. And pretty much every painting has, every page opening has a page of text and a page of image together. The most complete copy is the one in, the Manchester Library here, University Library, and that has today surviving 320 paintings, 318 folios and 285 paintings, and that is not complete either. So it's in that tradition of the Bhagavata Puranas and other manuscripts that have extensive illustrated programs. So the story tells us about the adventures of the Princess Chanda and the hero Lorak. As they fall in love, they elope, they go into exile, they have all kinds of adventures along the way. And it's a sort of a moralistic story, it's a romantic story, it's filled with a lot of the qualities that make up for a compelling and long-lived narrative. What complicates everything is that both of them are married at the time that they meet, so it doesn't make life easy for them. But also the most kind of frustrating for us today is that none of the manuscripts have the ending surviving. So we don't know what happens in the end. There are, and which is where, like, folk tales and oral narratives come into play, because the story does survive in oral tradition, but in different regions there are different endings. So which one did the 14th century version have don't know. But anyhow, I'll give you now a very quick, what I call the accelerated Cliff Notes version of the story before I get into the looking at specific images. Just take this out, sorry. Okay. So the story begins in the city of, the kingdom of Goa, which is praised for its natural beauty, for its bustling markets and the flora and fauna that are very much part of the urban life. Here at the palace of its ruler, al-Khemir, a beautiful baby girl is born who's named Chanda. When she is 6 years old, an appropriate husband is chosen for her who matches the caste, class, social class, economic class, etc. of the family, and she is sent off to be married to him. 12 years pass, and Chanda is one unhappy lady. Her husband is ugly, he's smelly, and in 12 years, he has never once shown her any affection, and her marriage remains unconsummated, and she is done. So she decides that it's time for her to go back home, and so she does. She goes back to her father's home, and one day a yogi who's passing by happens to see her in the balcony, and he's so struck by her beauty that he falls in love with her, and he's so afraid that he just fell in love with the king's daughter that he just leaves, starts traveling. And along his travels, he keeps singing songs of Chanda. And these are heard by one Raja Rao Rupchand, who is so taken by this yogi's descriptions of Chanda. He's totally in love with her, and he is determined to get her one way or another. So off he goes with his army and his chariots over to Rao Mihir's kingdom to say, hey, I hear you have a beautiful daughter, and I want her. This is a page in the exhibition. Diplomacy fails. And Mihir says, sorry, you can't have my daughter. You can have a horse instead. But Rupchand decides to pull out his artillery and arsenal, and everybody is in trouble. But we are saved, Meher is saved by the arrival of the hero Lorak, who is, manages to rally the troops and secures victory for Meher. The king is ecstatic, he needs to do something, so he organizes a celebratory banquet. No expenses spared, and we see all these delightful paintings of all the kind of fowl and animals and amounts of rice and feast that is being prepared for this celebratory banquet at which everybody in the town is invited, in the kingdom is invited. It is here, and now we are like 100 and some verses into the story, when Chanda and Lorak meet for the first time. So from the balcony up there, she sees him, and she's like, oh my God, he's so gorgeous. She's in love. Later that evening, he sees her, and everybody is very fond of fainting in this manuscript, and so he has to be taken home because he's overcome with love. But he has a problem. He doesn't know what to do. I mean, she has a husband who she left, but he has a wife who's very much with him. And so he goes off into the forest to become a yogi and to try and sort things out for himself. He spends a year there, but he still keeps thinking about Chanda. And so one day he figures out how to get, on a dark and stormy night, figures out how to get to her palace. He does. He makes it up there. She first attacks him for being an intruder, and then they spend a lovely night together. But a few days later, his wife finds out, and Lorak's two women end up running into each other at the temple one day. There's Chanda here and his wife Mena. They start talking, talking becomes arguing, arguing becomes a cat fight that gets so bad that the deity in the temple decides to leave because he doesn't want to be responsible for what will happen next. Now what to do? So Chanda and Lorak, Chanda convinces Lorak that we should just leave, let's go away from here, and so they do. He's not thrilled by the idea, but he goes along anyway. And they have all kinds of, again, adventures. Her husband comes to look for them. This is also a painting in the exhibition. They manage to get rid of him. They don't go too far, then a snake bites her, and he thinks she's dead, but that too is averted. And eventually, after a series of other episodes, they find welcome and hospitality with another king, and they are now settled there. But back home, his wife is still trying to figure out how she can get him back. And she learns that a merchant caravan trader knows or has heard about Lorak and Chanda's whereabouts. And so Surjan goes off to convince Lorak to come back. Lorak's guilt gets the better of him, and so he comes back home. Here we see him in the upper register meeting his mother while his wife prepares a meal. And that's where the manuscript ends. According to, again, as I say, going back to modern day retellings, which are not the most reliable source for a 14th century text, some say the two, everybody lives happily after with as co-wives. One version says she kills herself and he does too. The other says that he dies and then she dies too. So anyhow, regardless, since their identification in the 1960s, the Chandayan manuscripts have been recognized as important in the history of Indian book painting, primarily because of their stylistic features and their presumed relatively early date of the 16th century, and some of the versions are thought to be around the Bhagavata Purana that we saw earlier. Very little is known with certainty about these 5 manuscripts, whether they were produced where, when, whether they were produced in royal courts or commercial workshops, who the artists, patrons, or even audiences were. But the subject that has kind of interested me most about these manuscripts was about the relationships between text and image. And here we are seeing our from three of these manuscripts, the same verse. And you can see that there are shared qualities to them. And it opens up the question of who's looking at what. Is it a manuscript that the artists are looking at? Is it something else like a temple sculpture or some other type of sculptured form? Is it performance tradition? Is it a shared kind of cultural knowledge that is just being translated into visual form this way? And especially when there are hundreds of paintings in a manuscript, how does an artist retain visual interest? How do you prevent your audience from not getting bored? And for a story that presumably also is something that is well known. So it's not only a brand new story that everybody wants to turn the pages off to see what's happening. You already know very likely what is unfolding. So how does then the two, which is the text and image, work together? And again, and as other examples, and there are many of these examples, when you look at illustrations of the same verse, you can see that there are differences, but there are also stylistic elements. So the more I've looked at this, the more I've started to question some of the assumptions that have been made about this manuscript, one of which that just kind of struck me while I was doing research a few years ago was that there was an original presentation copy that was made when this text was first written, and that all subsequent copies have been inspired by that. But the more I look at this, what it seems is that different copies suggest that while there is the initial visual similarity occurs because the artists use the text for their cues, but maybe not necessarily exactly another painting. Because each manuscript is conceptually very different, and which we see, as Marika had also mentioned, through the treatment of time and space, as well as through composition and pictorial details. So each manuscript should therefore, I think, be considered as an independent production with its own coherent system of internal logic, and not necessarily a copy or derivative of something else. So here's just another example of this, but the example that I want to focus on is one which comes from verse 190. The text here describes the critical moment in the story, which is the arrival of Lorak at Chanda's palace on a dark and rainy night for his romantic interlude. Sorry, I don't have the color image of the one in the middle, which is in Berlin, but here is a painting in the center, which is from two paintings before, but it gives you a sense of the color scheme of the Berlin painting. So the one on the left, this one is in Varanasi at the Bharat Kala Bhavan. This is at the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin, and this one is in Manchester at the Rylands Library. Yeah. Actually, I'll go back here for a moment. Okay, so this is the first time that the lovers would be in each other's company and spend quality time together. According to the text of what comes slightly before it, Lorak reaches his palace on a dark and stormy night. He can barely see where he's going. It's all very mysterious and peril-filled. He reaches the palace, throws his rope up to climb to the balcony. She hears the sound of a falling object and comes to investigate. But when she sees Lorak below, she tries to be coy and playful, and every time the rope came to the balcony, she'd throw it back down. Soon she started to realize that if she doesn't do something, he'll probably go away. So the next time he throws the rope, she ties it to a column and then goes back to her bedroom, pretends to sleep, and then he comes up. So there are several important storytelling elements here. The fact that it's a clandestine meeting, it's filled with risk, It holds the promise of sensual experience, and which calls upon a range of emotions and actions from the two protagonists. There are also key temporal moments here that enable the story to move forward, and this is kind of the text that is on the facing page. So the parts that are highlighted in yellow are the action elements. So 1, he throws the rope. 2, she runs to secure it. He climbs up. She returns to her bed, and he reaches the balcony. So these actions take place almost like in this very synchronized series of action and response. He did, then she did. So the one is predicated upon the other. And it's also then about he thought and she thought. So one type of action is easy to represent, the other one is not, it's easy to feel. So both aspects end up being somehow factored into the painting. A spatial dimension is also important here because the action occurs in 2 separate spaces of the inside and the outside, upstairs and downstairs. So the impact of the painting therefore relies on the conveying of the narrative, exactly the story, its emotional impact, and a sense of place and timing. So the Berlin painting illustrates the opening couplets of the verse. The painting is read from bottom to top as the composition is divided into 2 registers to convey the spatial dimensions. What you can't see here is the color, which is, but it's a dark blue star-filled background, which kind of visually unifies the painting. Indicates the time of day and general setting, but provides no further understanding of the setting because the inside and the outside are still covered in that blue background. Lorak is shown at the bottom left of the picture. His figure is in an active pose, he's looking up, and that communicates his intensity of purpose to throw up the rope. He wants to get it up there with success. Oh, I'm sorry. I got the wrong one. This is... and here, Chanda's figure is running, conveying her sense of excitement. There's an attendant and a palace guard, which are extra textual elements. They're not mentioned in the text, but they are here to allude to the risky and clandestine nature of their meeting. So here the narrative is illustrated in this kind of compacted indexical manner. The principal elements are included, but the viewer is left to navigate the rest of the nuance by reading the text nearby. In the next painting, we see some of the same features, which again raise the question of, was one artist aware of the other copy or not, which is a separate topic. Here we have the similar type of relationship of the guard, the Lorak, Chanda, and but here we have a little more information because she's sitting up in her bed and she's holding the rope. So there is a conflation of the action. There are different moments of the story that are pulled together, and but without a particular sequential order. And so this has been described as a kind of a synoptic a way of representing imagery where multiple episodes of a story are depicted within a single frame, but without a sense of linearity of time. In the Manchester painting, sorry, I got my slides all sequenced out. The artist takes the last 3 lines of the verse as his primary subject matter. And here it is where the poet tells us that he's climbing up like an acrobat, very specifically acrobat. So here, actually, if you could go closer in, his toes are around the rope. He's climbing up, he's about to reach there, she's already in her bed, and there's a lot of information in what seems like a fairly simple painting. So we see the double-storied building that we see both simultaneously from inside and outside, and the viewer gets this ideal vantage point where we do get to see all of it in the same field of vision. So we get a privileged overall view. His figure is set against the dark background, it's emphasized, it's highlighted, it's also in this narrow right, like a vertical sliver. You can't mistake it, you have to focus on both of them together. They both have equal valence in the image. And there are three types of temporality that are indicated here, where there is the past, where the rope has already been tied, there is the present, and then there is the intimation of the future. So this is just one example of the ways in which artists manipulate their own medium, how they work off of what the poet has provided to them. And it's something like thinking about, the cinematic rendition of a favorite novel, and what is left out, what is created, how does each artist give their own medium a particular voice to speak in. So when we individually look at these paintings and look at the manuscripts within which each painting falls, we see that there is a particular ethos, a particular logic, a particular feel and mood for each manuscript that becomes sort of this alchemical process. And for anybody who's has been through illustrated books, whether they are comic books or picture books, even children's books do that beautifully. You turn page after page, and if the successful ones, everything else falls apart. You enter the world of the artist, you enter the world of the writer, and you become part of that. There is this alchemical kind of magic that happens with these books. And that's what happens in these 5 manuscripts as well, as in many of the other manuscripts that we have seen already today, and with Alka's talk we'll be seeing more of. And so when you are looking at manuscripts or paintings in galleries, remember that these were intended to be held in the hand, they were intended to be turned page after page. There's a tactility, and in that a sensuality that comes between the materiality of the object as well as what the viewer brings in as a response to the word and to the visual sense. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adamjee, for that very interesting lecture, especially for voicing the storytelling aspect and reconnecting us with the magic of this whole material. Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Alka Patel, who is professor of South Asian art in UCI, University of California, Irvine. And she has worked on various aspects again, but her main interest, at least initially, was architecture. No, in fact, her initial interest goes back to Spain, to early 9th century Spain, right? And from there, she moves to South Asia and is really specialized in South Asia. And she, particularly her work is interesting in questioning the art historian's way of looking at the material and in bringing the visual language to its not just historical roots, but political and other dimensions. Very interesting way of examining things. Speaking with her earlier today, when I asked her if she was enjoying teaching, she said yes, because you never know when the next art historian, the genius, would come from. That's the sign of a really good professor. She has a very interesting project at the moment in collaboration with another professor at the university, which will focus on the changing regional caste and religious identities of mercantile and banker castes from Gujarat, Rajasthan, and other areas of northern India as they migrated to the Deccan. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Patel, and we look forward to her lecture.
So I hope I can keep up the high standards that have been set before me. It's dark, so I can't fully see if people are taking a little snooze, but thank you to the museum and especially to friend and colleague Marika for having organized the exhibition first and now the symposium. It's always a pleasure to come to San Diego precisely because of Mr. Binney's collection and certainly to see good friends. Right. It seems to be globally accepted that the Shahnama, in its best-known iteration of about 55,000 verses by the poet Firdausi, dating to the beginning of the 11th century, is the great Iranian epic, and the monumental work's conceptual proscenium is Iranshar. In keeping with Dan's start, I also show a map indicating approximately the points of activity that are highlighted throughout the Shahnama. The encounters that famously result in the epic's timeless moral and political commentaries help to define for us in the 21st century not only the ancient idea of an Iranian cultural and to some extent geographical sphere, but also, to quote Charles Melville, Iranianness itself. In fact, it could be something of an understatement to say that Firdausi composed the Shahnama in Persian, since his verses came to set the standard for the very usage of Persian throughout the coming millennium and across the geographies where the language often figured as the primary means of communication, altogether abbreviated as the Persianate world. The Indic cultural sphere came to be an active and enduring participant within this linguistic ecumene pretty much from the time of Firdausi's world-famous verses. Thus, it is indeed understandable that the San Diego Museum of Art's Epic Tales exhibition would have some focus on the production of Shahnama manuscripts in the region. After all, as several scholars, including my colleague Qamar Adamjee, have pointed out, the 12th through 19th centuries saw the production of Persian language literary works in India at a staggering pace, in fact, exceeding that of Iran itself throughout the same period. The opportunity presented to me by Dr. Sardar and the museum to contribute to the exhibition catalog was, of course, extremely valuable, certainly for me, and hopefully for those who view the exhibition and also browse and read the catalog. The museum's truly impressive collection of Indian painting permitted an examination of the nature of Shahnama manuscript production and reception in India during the 16th through 18th centuries. The collection's expansive holdings from northern India as well as the Deccan meant encompassing the Mughal Empire and their much bullied sultanates to the south. So here you see three examples of works that are in the exhibition. I believe the Deccani folio is there. And just as an aside, it should be pointed out that you will, of course, read this in the catalog. The North Indian works are mainly not of royal production, but the Deccani manuscript was, and because of the direct links with the Safavids of Iran, it's possible that the Deccan actually saw a greater number of royal commissions of the Shahnama. Here, I would like to expand on the catalog contributions that I made in two ways. First, I believe new and important research on the Ghaznavids, who were Firdausi's accidental patrons, as we shall see below, is consequential for fresh examination of Firdausi's Shahnama, and I make an argument for it subsequently. Although at first the approach may seem circumstantial, I believe it can eventually lead scholars to reread Firdausi's Shahnama with different eyes, as it is quite possible that the work's very inception was arguably inspired almost as much by India as by Iran. Second, since we are about to shine a new spotlight on Ferdowsi's patrons and thus the longue durée moment in which he created his monumental work, let us also broaden our perspective to include Shahnama manuscripts produced in India during the immediate centuries after Ferdowsi completed his opus. These early works would have been produced at the numerous small Islamicate courts throughout the north of the subcontinent, which had emerged as the result of eastward migrations of several Islamized pastoral nomadic groups from present-day Afghanistan and Central Asia. This is what I argue in my current book. In the catalog and elsewhere, it has been argued that during the Mughal period and onward, the Shahnama did not command the same pride of place in India in terms of cultural resonance and royal patronage as it did in Greater Iran. But was this always the case, even in the early centuries after Ferdowsi's composition? Before attempting to answer that question, I turn briefly to recent research by my friend and colleague Ali Anushar at the University of California, Davis, whose work has broad consequences, I believe, for our understanding not only of the Ghaznavids' reception of Ferdowsi's magnum opus, it could hint at a newfound relevance of the Shahnama for the Indic cultural sphere. Of course, the invaluable scholarship of eminent thinkers such as Akhtar Shervo and others has already analyzed Indo-Iranian linguistic relationships during the first millennium of the Common Era. Additionally, modern scholarship in Persian, for example, by Jalal Khalegi Motlagh and Merdad Bahar, has examined the Shahnama's Rustam cycle. Among its better-known and circulated narratives and its consonances with aspects of the various Vaishnavite Krishna cycles and possibly other Indian epics. And here I show a folio on the left from a companion page to two of the folios that are in the exhibition, but this particular page is at LACMA, and of course, I borrow one of Marika's Ramayana illustrations to show not only the visual commonality, but the thematic one between these heroes battling demons. As Dan pointed out, Krishna was certainly in the business ever since his childhood. I am grateful to the scholar and translator Dick Davis for these references, who has already noted that the hero Rustam's maternal origins lay at Kabul, which was considered a part of the Indic world within the Shahnama's own reckoning, thus pulling the eastern periphery into the very center of the work. Rather than being simply the residue of millennia-long connections between Greater India and Iran then, I would suggest that these Indic echoes were much more purposeful and ensuing from the historical and geographical locus of Ferdowsi's composition. The codification into written form of the immense orally transmitted repository of epic cycles, which we refer to as the Shahnama, was intriguingly initiated at the city of Tus in Khorasan. These are images from one of the major madrasas, the remains of which actually had to be excavated. In the mid-10th century, this was the western peripheral court of the Samanids, whose local governor retained the services of the poet Abu Mansur Daqiqi to render the already famous Shahnama series of stories into verse form. At a time when patronage of the arts was incumbent upon rulers as an act ingrained within empire building and consolidation, this very idea was an ambitious and aspirational project. It aimed to recuperate in monumental literary form the deep civilizational history of Greater Iran, which had suffered during the Islamization of the erstwhile Sasanian lands. However, the untimely death of Daqiqi, after having completed only about 1,000 verses, occurred in tandem with the waning of the Samanid house. The resulting politico-economic vacuum was filled by their former Turkic military ghulams, or slaves, the Ghaznavids, who had carved out a base of power in modern Afghanistan. The inheritor of the Shahnama project, Abu al-Qasim Firdausi, also of Dus, or the environs thereof, abruptly then pivoted his aim toward pleasing the mighty Sultan Mahmud of Ghazna, who, together with his fellow Turks, the Seljuks of Iran, was among the most powerful and renowned rulers and patrons reigning in the medieval Persianate world. And here is a view of the tomb of Firdausi near Dus. It was constructed in the early 20th century, but you see, as my colleague Talin Gregor has argued, that in fact, architecturally, it makes references to ancient Iranian architecture all the way from Achaemenid times onward. And of course, the stairway that goes up the side has scenes from the Shahnama evoked by Sasanian reliefs. So in modern scholarship, the Ghaznavids have been considered as westward-looking, aspiringly Persianate rulers themselves, their numerous India forays being nothing more than raids with no long-term ambitions. Instead, the extorted or plundered Indian gains supported their Western campaigns of annexation as far as Rai, just south of Tehran, and Isfahan, to the very heart of the Seljuk centers of power. However, recent research in Ghaznavid historical sources has led Ali Anushar to reinterpret their infamous India raids. He suggests that, in fact, the early Ghaznavids were building a dyadic state, facing west to Khorasan, but equally facing east to India. Although their Indian campaigns left no monumental architecture, the Ghaznavids certainly issued coinage series that incorporated Indic iconographies and references, and of course, even Indic script. So here's Nandi, the Shaivite bull, in the famous Bull and Horseman series, and references to Mahmud, in fact, in the local vernacular script. So our perception of Ghaznavid activity 1,000 years hence is surely very different from Firdausi's own time. While for us, the Ghaznavids' India raids appear ephemeral, it is quite possible that Firdausi and his contemporaries saw them as Anushar suggests, namely campaigns of annexation that were very much a part of the Ghaznavids' imperial plan. We will likely never know all the reasons for Mahmud Ghaznavid's disappointing response to Firdausi, who had expected greater reward for such a splendid literary production. But one could nonetheless hypothesize that the ruler was apparently stingy in his praise and recompense, at least partly because in Firdausi's telling of the Shahnama, the author did not have more references to India, which could have served as thinly veiled proclamations of Mahmud's Indian successes, as was the norm for court-patronized works. In any case, among the many remarkable legacies of Firdausi's Shahnama as a time and space-bound artifact, an enduring one is the sewing together of India and Iran, not in a synthesis, I would say, but rather in a meaningful juxtaposition. So shortly after Firdausi's completion of the Shahnama, how did the work fare in India? Quite possibly the other half of its cultural reference and literary equation. Into what milieu would the Shahnama have been received? And how would it have been treated? Of course, this is a question that scholars have expended considerable effort to answer and will continue to do so, as it has many layers to explore. Since we are looking at the visual treatment of the work, it perhaps behooves us to familiarize ourselves with the visual landscape of India during the centuries immediately following Firdausi's 11th century composition. The works surviving from the 12th century, perhaps dating only 100 years or so after Firdausi's completion of his Shahnama, circa 1010, are in a style almost exclusively associated with Jain manuscript production. Early manuscripts were on palm leaf, which determined their horizontal format, having a space for a central string hole binding the leaves together. The style has been well studied by scholars since at least the 1960s and dubbed the Western Indian style by some due to its patronage by the Jain merchants of present-day Gujarat and Rajasthan. Although some of the known manuscripts are indeed from Western India, many others were made at various centers throughout the north, such as Mandu and Jaunpur, both locales that were also important for Persian manuscript production in the 15th and 16th centuries. As such, this style has a set of recognizable features, but regional variations definitely come to the fore depending on a manuscript's place of origin. Nevertheless, the style has been described as quite conservative, and perhaps rightly so, due to some of its elements remaining seemingly fixed through the 16th century. Moreover, Jain manuscripts did not fully transition from palm leaf to paper until the mid-1400s, really an entire century after the medium's introduction to India by about 1300, and even then retaining the horizontal format, not to mention the central string hole, which, when necessary, was transformed into a decorative motif. So you see that here. However, as we examine these manuscripts side by side with contemporaneous Persian manuscripts, and particularly the Shahnamas, thought to come from India, a corpus that is itself only partially known, we not only see the dialogue between the two ambits, we also begin to question the conservatism attributed to both the Western Indian style and perhaps even Jainism itself. The number and variety of illustrated Shahnamas made in India during the 14th through early 16th centuries is truly amazing, represented here by works attributed to India at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Although the invaluable Cambridge Shahnama project has made a valiant effort to document manuscripts in both Indian collections and abroad, it seems that there will always be disagreement among scholars as to the true identity of some, particularly those without surviving colophons or other verifiable data. The problem of identification is multifaceted. First, the styles of Persian manuscripts in India during this period were as varied as the Western Indian style Jain manuscripts seem to have been unified, and the region's political landscape counted many centers of political power as well as artistic patronage, spanning all of northern India and the Deccan, the latter not absorbed into the Mughal Empire until the early 17th century. Finally, in Greater Iran, the veritable explosion of Shahnama illustration in the 14th and 15th centuries was accompanied by the burgeoning of many so-called provincial ateliers throughout Iran and modern Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, so that manuscripts deviating from styles associated with the great centers such as Shiraz and Herat have been tossed between the categories of provincial Persian and Indian. The majority of Shahnama folios and manuscripts either known to be of Indian origin through their colophons or otherwise attributed to the region date to the 15th and early 16th centuries, though there is one 14th century group of folios that some scholars also have assigned to India. This last includes folios shared between the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin and the Freer Gallery in Washington, D.C., along with another possible manuscript at the Gamma Institute in Bombay. I use the Freer folio as an example. Based on the overall composition, one might instantly look to Injuid Shahnamas from Shiraz. But B.W. Robinson insisted that, quote, to an eye familiar with the styles known to have been practiced in Persia at this time, there is something rather alien about it. Some of the colors, the thin, spindly outlines, the horror vacui of the crowded little composition, these find no parallel in the metropolitan styles of Tabriz and Baghdad or in the Inju style, end quote. Jain manuscripts of the 14th century may provide circumstantial evidence in favor of an Indian origin for these contemporaneous folios. Barbara Schmitz has already pointed out that the Jain manuscripts Sahis, being the Shaka or Scythian rulers whom the monk Kalaka approached for aid in his war to rescue his abducted sister from King Gardabila, were likely drawn from a number of non-Indian sources. These figures were consistently portrayed as ruddy and round-faced, hearkening to contemporaneous prototypes in northwestern Iran, and possibly the Shahnamas being profusely illustrated for the consumption of the Ilkhanid rulers. Of course, the link does not unequivocally prove that these 14th century folios were produced in India, as the Jain painters could have accessed imported manuscripts for their inspiration. However, it does point to the possibility that artists trained in the Ilkhanid traditions could have been painting Shahnamas in India. The 15th and early 16th century Shahnamas accepted as of Indian origin are the ones that present variety of execution ranging from unmistakably Indian to something practiced in Greater Iran at the time. Our task as scholars is further enriched, not to say complicated, by the awareness that frequently there was simultaneity in styles at major sultanate centers such as Mandu, Jaunpur, and Gujarat. At these locales, Jain manuscripts continue to be commissioned in the style usually associated with them since at least the 12th century, if not earlier, even as Shahnamas and other Persian texts were generally painted, with one exception treated below, in the styles traceable primarily to Injuid and Timurid painting in Shiraz and Herat. The one manuscript that leaves little doubt as to its Indian origin is the fascinating Shahnama first published by B.N. Goswami in 1988, and for which the author coined the term Jainesque due to its obvious connections with the style typically associated with Jain manuscript painting. Unfortunately, the work has no colophon or other indicator of date or place of production, but it is generally accepted as having been made in northern India in the early to mid-15th century. The characteristics shared between the Shahnama and Jain manuscripts include the monochrome red background, loving attention to textiles, stylized poses of the figures, and even at times the ceremonial regalia of decorated umbrellas or chhatris. Indeed, the adaptation of the Western Indian style to the Shahnama manuscript is complete enough to invert the order of the male and female figures according to the direction of the associated script. So you see the male figure on the right in the Persian or the Shahnama, and of course on the left in the Jain, in the Kalakacharya Katha folio. And it is also noteworthy that all of the characters in the various stories, including the women, are depicted similar to the Sahis we encountered in the Kalakacharya Katha scenes, rather than to the Jain monk Kalaka. Due to the manuscript's subject matter, it has been attributed generally to Muslim patronage in northern India. However, is it unreasonable to explore the possibility that a Jain patron or someone who was not Muslim commissioned the manuscript? By the mid-15th century, in fact, the supposedly very conservative Jain manuscripts had themselves absorbed important new elements into their repertory, such as exquisite floral and geometric arabesque borders that now frame the main narrative fields. Moreover, These borders also began to include scenes of the very un-Jain activities of hunting, seen here in the chase after deer in a flowering forest, as well as camel fighting and even war. These inclusions were, perhaps, inevitable given the practice of more Persianate-style painting side by side with the Western Indian style at important centers of artistic patronage, such as Jaunpur and Mandu, mentioned before, and probably others. But a specific familiarity with epic cycles such as the Shahnama is demonstrated by these borders' inclusions of identifiable narrative scenes such as Bahram Ghur hunting with Azadeh, this here. There are also scenes of enthroned rulers, not unlike what we saw in the Jainesque Shahnama, and perhaps as yet unidentified scenes that may be linked to this or other Persianate epic cycles. The painstaking detail lavished on the borders is only one step away from full-size narrative manuscripts, making the possibility of a non-Muslim, possibly Jain patron for the Shahnama perhaps a little more plausible. Nor should the treatment of the figures as sahis throughout the work discourage this consideration, for while this figural distinction hints that Jain manuscript painters or others perceive the work and its protagonists as foreign or at least non-Jain, they did not necessarily consider it ritually impure or otherwise undesirable. Kalaka himself, after all, enlisted the help of the Sahi king in his righteous cause. In the end, then, what can we say about the reception of Firdausi Shahnama in India during the early centuries after its composition? First, it should be noted that Shahnama illustration in India seems to have escalated during the 14th and 15th centuries, coinciding with developments in Greater Iran. Thus, India was well connected with the wider Persianate world, being a part of its trajectories in real time, an observation that should underscore the inadequacy of sweeping art historical categorizations such as provincial Persian. Furthermore, we have contemplated the possibility that the Shahnama drew attention far beyond the spheres of the Muslim rulers of the Indian sultanates, to which it has generally been assigned. Everyone loves a good story, as you were all on the edges of your seat with the lack of the ending in the Chandayan. So it is worth considering that this timeless epic also commanded patronage among the prosperous mercantile strata of Sultanate India, even prior to the Mughal period. Such a consideration not only attests to the power of the Shahnama to appeal across socioeconomic and cultural worlds, it also opens up analytical vistas into the non-royal ambits of Sultanate India. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Patel, for that academically rich and thought-provoking lecture. Now we come to the last part of this meeting of ours, which involves you. We would like to hear from you and have your questions. But before that, I believe we're going to have a panel here, discussion. So we invite our scholars to come and join us. Once the table is set. So we have heard from 4 scholars today in different styles in a way, but each one of them certainly brings an aspect of Indian culture to us. The Bhagavata, the Ramayana, the Chandayan, the Shahnameh, and the stories within stories, but what comes very strongly is the relationship between the narrative, the text, and the image. You know, this, especially in Qamar and sorry, I'm having a mental, because there is movement here. In Qamar and Marika's work. So in the two presentations, we heard mainly about that relationship of narrative and picture. In Dan has, you know, highlighted the dispersal of these pages around and how the transfer of compositional images, the structure of the works, you know, can be found between earlier times and, you know, later representations, and how that travels and transfers, even if we don't know exactly how that happened. That was fascinating. So there are a lot of questions that are churning here. And I think that the first questions would bring in, we don't have to go chronologically, we just would like to go thematically rather than chronologically here. So, your questions.
For Dr. Ehnbom, regarding the Bhagavata, as you know, we have the Mysore manuscript in the exhibition, which is a bound volume. I was just curious, how many originally bound volumes do you think existed of the Bhagavata, and how many remain intact?
Well, the traditional form of the manuscript in India is unbound. And so binding a Bhagavat, I know of another example from Malwa from the 16th century. It was clearly bound, but I would say apparently rather loosely bound. So the original format of the manuscript was, before the coming of paper, was on palm leaf, and they were stacked. They had holes in them, and there were cords used to keep them together. So they weren't bound in the sense of a Western or an Islamic codex. Mm-hmm. So that's that wonderful Mysore volume, which I find very interesting. Being bound is a kind of cultural change, and the format of that too. It's a vertical format. The traditional format for an Indian manuscript is a horizontal format. So that's a very interesting manuscript. In general, Sanskrit manuscripts were not bound in the way that we think of binding. They were gathered together. They had covers of wood or of sort of thickened paper, and then they'd be sometimes then tied. Ties would go around. They'd be wrapped in cloth, a traditional way of keeping them. But I think it's one of the things that contributed to the dispersal of so many manuscripts was that it was simply so easy to do. You didn't even have to do the brutal act of removing a page from a bound volume, of cutting pages out. And we all know many terrible stories of the dispersal of manuscripts, some of them quite recent, some of them by people we know. As a matter of fact, I think there's a special place in hell for people who cut up intact manuscripts. But then I know people who will be in that special place. But it's very easy to. I mean, when you have folios that aren't physically connected to each other, it's very easy to scatter them, and that's really what's happened.
Easier to sell, more lucrative anyway. It's easier to sell, Dan, no?
I'm sorry?
It's easier to sell. these pages?
Certainly, it's a dealer, I regret to say, generally makes more money selling something page by page than selling something that's intact. And you know, this great dispersed Bhagavat that I've worked on, it was all together in the mid-50s in when it came into the hands of a dealer, and it was in fact offered intact, but no one wanted to spend, and it was big, so no one wanted to spend all that money, so it was scattered, and now you have to go all over the world. There's a page in Stockholm. There are pages everywhere, it seems, and things turn up. We have a page at the University of Virginia. I always say, you can see how thoroughly dispersed it was, that we have a page at the University of Virginia.
Paradoxically, it's probably what saved them, right?
Well, I'd like to think that I helped save it from, it's a particularly nice page, and it was in a private collection in New York. It had left the group of pictures, the series, a long time ago. But Binny bought his fairly early, within I think a decade of the breakup of the series of paintings. He had at least, I don't know the exact sequence. I don't know if he bought all four together. I suppose one could look at the records and see that. But it was intact in Bombay in the 50s, and Binny had them by the 60s. He was very eager to go out and, when things appeared on the market, there he was.
No, but it's fascinating that the love of this American collector, makes this happen. It's fascinating. This is a paradox of things,
Well,
that he collected them and that.
The history of collecting is inextricably tied up with the history of the market, and they're
Yes.
they're very interesting questions.
What is our next question here? Can't see them.
While the microphone is going, I'll just say one last thing to Anita's question, which, aside from the unusual format of this Mysore manuscript you're talking about, the fact that it has survived intact is, in fact, remarkable. And I think maybe that was also what you're getting at, and it is a very special part of the collection here. So very nice to be able to see a book, in its original form in the exhibition, and to be able to turn all the pages and look at all the paintings through an iPad feature in the show.
Yeah, the 1594 Ramayana in Doha that was commissioned by Akbar's mother. I mean, that's a rare, again, very rare, for these epics to survive.
That's right.
Hi, my name is Sunny, and I was wondering, what is the current atmosphere between Iran and India about exchange of information about these antiquities? That's one question.
Exchange.
In other words, is there how much interest is there in, say, with the Persian Iranian government with free exchange of information about these antiquities with, say, India or anyone else?
Well, probably since the last couple of months, that might have...
Could you turn up the mic a little, please? It's hard to hear you.
Better?
No.
Okay. So probably given recent political actions, things have changed considerably, but certainly if we look specifically at the interactions between the modern nation states of India and Iran, actually there is certainly a flow of both business interests as well as some intellectual back and forth. So scholars do that. Kind of like the Jaipur story, however, where it's virtually impossible to see certain manuscripts. I encountered that in Iran, some very, very important Mughal manuscripts or albums ended up, thanks to an 18th century raid in Iran, and it's extremely difficult to see those, and I don't think it's really the kind of workings, the on-site rules of the museum collections, you know, it's hard when one has traveled a long way and it's so difficult to see something important. But that's what I can say at present. Certainly, there continues to be a dialogue between India and Iran, and in fact, I saw a number of seem to be, you know, my countrymen, Indians in Iran when I was there, but this was in 2011. So again, with the fluctuating political fortunes of Iran as on the global stage, these things do have repercussions.
My second question, I wanted to ask one of you later if you have, does any of you have any specific information, knowledge that is of the automata, which there's a copy of in the Topkapi Museum?
You mean the automata by
Al-Jazari?
Al-Jazari? Oh, no, but that goes back to Iraq, 11th century Iraq. The automata is
no, I was just curious.
the technical devices. That is Indian, yeah.
And the third comment was, my mother was born in Turkey. She was Armenian. And then when I did a DNA with 23andMe, it turned out I was 41% Persian.
Oh.
It was like a surprise.
Reincarnation. Just the right context for it. So, in other words, her question is, if I understand you right, the mechanical devices of Al-Jazari, which was illustrated again and again, you know, from Iraq, there are Syrian copies especially, and so on, were there illustrated examples of Al-Jazari's book in India? That's the question.
Yes, there were.
Yes.
So could you tell us something about that? Who would like to take this question?
Qamar?
I haven't seen the illustrations, but I do know that there is one copy that was, at least one. The text was translated from Arabic into Persian and copied and presumably illustrated in Mandu in the 15th century. But
Yes, I've actually...
at least that's one.
Yes,
There
I've
should
seen
be
some
more.
of that. I in fact, just saw some of that. And indeed, it's interesting. I haven't really, I haven't done any comparative work to look at various manuscripts to see to what degree, again, how is the transmission visual or how is it from the text? But the text is very specific about the description of these automatas, so anyway. But yes, there were illustrated versions done in India. And Mandu in Malwa, and Alka showed material from Mandu, is a very rich place for the production of manuscripts, illustrated manuscripts in a variety of styles. So that's, I think, a very rich area to look at. And it includes Al-Jazari.
Okay, so, my name is Jeffrey Lehman. I hope this question isn't too simple, but you are referring constantly to these countries that didn't exist in those time periods, and I'm trying to figure out how you determine what is, because there's no such thing as India, you know, there's these city-states, and the same thing with...
That's not true, actually. India existed as a concept. It was a variety of states, but there was a concept of this place called India.
I was thinking even in larger context when we're talking about Iran, Iraq, and that. So, for example, is it in this concept that you're talking about as India that has all these different peoples and all these different languages, is that along the lines of the traditions, or is it the religions, or is it the geographical? What is it that makes, in those ancient times before we have our modern lines that say this is this country and this is that country, what is it that's, or is it the genetics? What is it that's saying that this is this country, or this is this concept of a country, and this is that a concept?
This is for Alka.
So I'm going to have to like eat this or something. seems like a simple question, but actually it's an excellent one. And I think, in fact, cultural production is a big part of defining, I guess, what I think of as cultural spheres, which are very loosely kind of geographically determinable, but the edges, I mean, I think we become very accustomed to hard and fast political boundaries and passports and so forth. That is the major difference, I think, between the pre-modern world. So that there are cultural and linguistic conceptions, and I sort of had those overlapping circles for, you know, a number of reasons. That
and I appreciated that.
That in fact, when you think of, or when I think of the Persianate world, indeed the corners of it, if you will, actually are incorporated into other cultural geographies and worlds. So I think it's a very good question, and it's something that, first of all, it's extremely important to look at cultural production to determine what exactly that might have meant. Not that it ever gives a unitary, kind of even unidirectional definition, but as Dan mentioned, I think that conceptually, Iran Shah definitely existed. You know, colleagues of mine who work in ancient Iran are thinking about the geographical expanse exactly of what this would be. And sometimes I think, well, you know, you can try, but is that really going to answer any more important questions? I mean, it's more conceptual and very fuzzy at the boundaries rather than a hard and fast concept.
So what you're saying is that it's really more cultural than genetic that defines what those ancient boundaries were. Is that right? Or as much?
Linguistic. So yes, cultural is probably a good kind of broad term. And I mean, if, you know, one didn't, in the pre-modern world before the time of passports, there certainly wasn't 23andMe. So, I mean, there are actually some Arabic, Persian, and other texts that talk about physiognomy or like describing peoples in different parts of the world. It's probably about as close as genetic analyses that one can get to. I think actually your question is enlightening in that it makes us think about the very different ways of knowing now and at other times. And in fact, it's not, you know, even like a progression thing. Even now, I think in some parts of the world, space is conceived and understood differently from hard and fast boundaries or citizenships.
But there were also, I mean, keeping with what Alka's saying too, there were periods of, you know, what the boundaries mean, as you say, is another matter, and boundary in our modern term is very different from the kind of fuzziness of the boundary of the pre-modern world. But there were periods of political centralization in India in which much of the subcontinent, at least nominally, came under a some kind of central government. The Mauryan Empire of the 4th to 2nd century BC, for example, in some, and the Mauryans had a very highly developed system of control and a very highly developed system gathering intelligence. It was said that there was not a crossroad in the empire that didn't have an informer who was passing information that ultimately went up to the capital. But, and there's a great poem from probably the Gupta period by Kalidasa, the cloud messenger, in which the sort of heavenly narrator is passing over and talking about the differences, but is conceiving of this area as a kind of cultural unity. So on the one hand, you've got the great, which is the issue that faces the modern Republic of India, you've got the great disparities, the great differences, the great linguistic and cultural and ethnic and dietary differences. On the other hand, there is still some sense of cultural unities. And at independence in 1947, an original proposal was that the name India would in fact disappear, that neither Pakistan nor India would take it, that Pakistan would be Pakistan, and India would be Bharat, which is a name by which India is frequently known. But India called it the Republic of India, and there were many in Pakistan, in fact, who were quite annoyed by that, who thought that the name India was going to be an historical relic, and these two countries would have different names, but it didn't work out that way.
But throughout history,
the Indus
dynasties
River-
seems to focus, ruling dynasties seems to focus a sense of the region and culture and centers of production for the arts, and dynasties, I think, played a role. Marika and Qamar, would you like to add something?
Yes, just one other thing, that geography also helps determine and define this kind of sense of space, where the Indus River, the Sindhu, is what gives demarcates to some extent that region and defines it from the Iran Share and the Afghanistan and so on. So natural boundaries like mountains and rivers really help define that.
Funny thing is, though, that
And
the
then
Indus is
they connect,
mercurial.
yeah.
It
Well, exactly.
changes a lot.
So that's,
Right.
that's the other problem. I mean, those boundaries as much connect as they divide. So,
Absolutely.
they create those channels.
My name's
at the
Robert.
back, please. We have a question. Oh, we have another one?
Yeah,
Okay,
I'm
sorry.
Robert Neville. Sabiha, thank you for moderating this journey.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Dr. Ehnbom, there were slides up there of Krishna in blue and in black. Do you know where or why the difference, or where the difference came from?
I'm sorry, what was the Krishna?
Krishna is represented in blue, and
Right.
there were one or two images in black.
Did I show a black Krishna?
No.
They were darker and lighter blues.
Maybe in the Hari
Well, I
Vansh,
think it's
there was
supposed
a
that
dark.
It's black and white image, probably.
There and
very dark.
there were very dark blues, but the difference between black and blue isn't so clear in Sanskrit, and there's the shade off into. He is the dark god, and the convention is showing him as blue, and sometimes, as in the Kangra pictures, you see him as a very pale, pretty blue, and sometimes he's a very dark and intense blue. Sometimes he's even green, and I've never been able to quite figure that out, but you do see the occasional green Krishna popping up, and why that should be, whether that's just pigment change or what, I'm not sure. It might be. It might be. But he is the dark god, and his brother Balarama is white. But again, he's not consistent. Even in that dispersed Bhagavat, not every representation of Balarama shows him as the same color. I believe there were different artists working, but he is the dark god. And that the convention for that is blue. But he's so dark. There's a blue sheen, I guess. I mean, the conventional description of Krishna is he was a pastoral god who was taken up into the pantheon, and this is a process that went on over a long time, and it's reflected in his story. I mean, he's pastoral, but he also is a ruler, and there are actually pastoral groups in India who claim descent from him, just as there was a ruling dynasty in Pakistan who claimed descent from Krishna. The Samad dynasty claimed descent from Krishna. And they all had, not only did they have Islamic names, they all had Sanskrit names as well, which is, and again, a kind of interesting fusion.
We have time for one last question. I see somebody at the back. Or you?
Yeah, we're over here.
The light,
I promise a gentleman over here, and then we'll get to Lucy Holland in the back.
Okay, two more questions.
So thank you guys all for coming here. I actually learned a lot from this. I mean, my whole life I've been Hindu, but I've never actually understood the context or the stories behind it. You guys had mentioned actually that these manuscripts and stuff were sent out and dispersed. Were they for the public, or were they more private or for priests, or how were they shared? Because right now you said that you actually had a couple slides of how they're displayed at a museum versus how people got to actually have the tactile and the feel. Oh, the tactile feel of it. So how were they dispersed? Did common people, was it a caste system? How did they get?
Well, I think what we're talking about as far as dispersed means the very most recent history of these manuscripts in how they entered the art market, something that is a fairly new phenomenon, and the interest in these manuscripts outside of India, and the idea that you could make money by selling individual pages. So that's one part of what you're asking. So this dispersal is from the private, royal, or temple, or other collections that they were originally in to coming outside of India. But as far as the original context, each of the manuscripts we've discussed, I'd say, has a different origin story. So some of the things we looked at were definitely made for royal patrons. The examples for Akbar and his circle that we talked about, but others had different stories. So for the dispersed Bhagavata, as we...
Well, and people argue about the dispersed Bhagavata. My colleague and friend Andrew Topsfield, who's just retired from the Ashmolean, thinks it was made for royal patronage in Mewar. I say I think it was made in Mathura, and I think it was made for wealthy merchants. And we do have documentation of wealthy merchants as patrons. We have documentation of minor aristocracy as patrons. We have documentation of grander aristocracy, kings, emperors, and so on. But there are many stories, and there are many modes of patronage, and we haven't sorted them all out yet. I've just been looking at a collection that came to the Ashmolean in 2012. It was a collection that was put together by a very distinguished scholar of medieval India named Simon Digby, who was actually born in India and wanted to die in India and got his wish. He did. But many of these things can only be described as rough, and clearly they were not exalted patronage. They were I don't know, made at different levels. But we know there were different levels, but I don't think we've got that all sorted out yet. But we're working on it. But we like the really grand things that were made for emperors and kings. The things that have a lot of gold, and I mean, I like shiny things.
Unfortunately, this will have to be our last question due to time. Thank you.
I just want to say I'm Lucy Holland. Thank you all so much. It's been so amazing. All of your presentations, very informative. Professor Ehnbom, as a former student, I fondly remember your subjecting us to these elaborations that you alluded to. And I think it just so enriches our understanding. And I'm wondering, I have two questions. One is if you could elaborate a little more on the format and how the earliest incarnations of the Bhagavata may have informed the later Mughal representations. I thought that was very interesting. And then the second question is, why has it been so difficult to access that manuscript in the Jaipur palace?
You'll have to ask the Jaipur royal family. I don't know. And it's been difficult since the 19th century. A man named Handley made some photographs in the 19th century, which for years, that was what people saw. Then they allowed some photography of the Ramayana, which you alluded to, and some of that was published. But I don't know. But in terms of format, I think it's a very interesting question. And the idea of the degree to which things are horizontal versus vertical. We think of the horizontal as traditional Indian. We think of the vertical as a sort of Islamic format, but that doesn't necessarily hold true in that kind of, and my own sense, and there are exceptions, but in a general way, I think that up until about the middle of the 17th century, in general, if you are dealing with a text like the Bhagavata Purana or the Ramayana, or the Kalpasutra and Kalakacharya Katha, a kind of religious texts from, relatively speaking, conservative traditions, they tend to preserve the horizontal format. Sometimes, but then when there are newer texts like the Rasika Priya that was composed by Keshav Das in the 1590s, the illustrators were permitted more freedom, and they might do a vertical format. And then you see sometimes, if one were able to look at those Jaipur manuscripts instead of just looking at photographs, but sometimes, even though the format of the book is a vertical format, they've turned the illustration on its side. So you would, if you were able to look at it, you would flip it, and you would then have a horizontal format. So those horizontal formats are long-lasting and get incorporated in a variety of ways. By about the middle of the 17th century, those distinctions between vertical and horizontal, I think, began to fall away. In the 18th century, you have many vertical format Bhagavats, Ramayana illustrations, and so on. But there is a time when and I think then format ceases to have the same kind of meaning that it did earlier. But in the earlier times, I think that there's a fairly consistent, I mean, Chandayanas are vertical format, but as you pointed out, they're sometimes broken up into registers where individually each one has a horizontal format. So that horizontal format, and exactly. Exactly. And so that's that's a deeply rooted compositional idea in South Asia. So that the horizontal can be put into the vertical so that overall the page is vertical, but when you break the composition down, it's still horizontal. And that goes back to the earliest manuscripts we have. By the nature of palm leaf, they had to be horizontal.
Thank you. I trust you feel much richer and knowledgeable than when you first walked in this morning. It has been a really interesting and inspiring symposium. Please join me in thanking our illustrious panel here of speakers today. And one last word, please go and see the exhibition more than one time. It's quite dense, and have the catalog and celebrate what has been brought to San Diego. It is really wonderful. And coming from outside and seeing this here, it just feels like you have a treasure, not just because you have the collection, but because it's being now shown and highlighted in this creative way. And the dispersal of these pages around the world to bring them together, to sort of save their soul and their spirit. This is the kind of project that does that. The very concept of the exhibition does that, bringing text, narrative and image, and our distinguished scholars today have done tremendously in that. Thank you so much.